All right. Well, because I know there's so much we want to talk about today during our conversation, we can go ahead and get started, and some folks might join us a little bit later. So hi, everyone. I'm Ella Banerjee. I'm the Community Partnership Manager at Voice of Witness. Super excited you all are here with us today. Just as we settle in, I want to take a few moments to share some norms for our time together. Please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Feel free to share your name, any organization or school that you're affiliated with, as well as what land you're calling from. If you're not sure about the Indigenous land you're on, you can go to native-land.ca, which is a great resource to find out more about whose land you're on. Also, please feel free to use the chat box to engage throughout the event today. You can share comments, reactions, feelings, as well as questions. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat box for especially questions so that we can bring them up later at the Q&A at the end of the conversation. One ask is that we do want to please make sure your display name matches the name you use while registering for this workshop. You can include like a nickname or anything else next to that registered name, but we do want to do that because that helps us keep track of who's able to join us during the actual webinar. And there's also automated caption options near the toolbar. So yeah. I also want to give a little bit of background for those who might not know about us, about Voice of Witness. We're the organization that's excited to host this event series. So for some people might just be getting to know us for the first time today. Some people might be a little bit familiar, but for some background, so Voice of Witness, we're also known as VOW, is an oral history nonprofit. And our mission is to advance human rights by amplifying the stories of people impacted by and fighting against injustice through oral history, education, and advocacy. And in our programming and our partnerships, we work with communities to document and to center unheard voices, teach ethics-driven storytelling, and develop educational resources. One of our key programs is our oral history book series. And each of our books focuses on a human rights issue and shares first-person narratives from people directly impacted by that particular issue. Right now, we have over 20 books in our series, which we're very proud of. And that includes a new book called Beginning Again, which focuses on migration and resettlement in the Appalachia region, which will be coming out this June, on June 20th, actually, for World Refugee Day. So again, that book is called Beginning Again, and I hope you'll keep your eyes out and maybe follow VOW to learn more about that book because we're really excited about it. It's many years in the making. We also have an educational program as well, which brings curriculum and other resources to teach oral history and important social issues to classrooms across the country. We also develop community partnerships with many different types of organizations and individuals to support them in their own storytelling work. So if you are learning more about Voice of Witness today, feel free to check out our website or to reach out to any of us panelists where we can share more information about the work that we do, the oral history book series, and education and community partnership work that we do, and we can find ways to connect. So today we're really excited to have what is the third session of our oral history and practice event series. So in these conversations, we've been talking to oral history practitioners with community who are now working on community rooted storytelling projects. These conversations have been a chance for all of us to not only learn more about these projects and listen to some powerful oral history excerpts, but really explore together the connection between oral history and community, and how we can use storytelling to deepen advocacy, representation, relationship building, narrative change, and a whole host of other themes. In addition, the individuals who have been our guest speakers in this series are close collaborators with the Voice of Witness community, and we just love talking to them, and we think that you all will too. So we're really honored for our third, to have our third series today with Rae, who is also a VOW Storyteller Initiative Fellow, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about. So I just want to introduce our two speakers who are going to be having a conversation together today. So first is Dao Tran. Dao is the editorial director at Voice of Witness, and she's also on the editorial board of Haymarket Books. Dao, do you want to just say hi, maybe say your pronouns and share where you're calling from?
Oh, you caught me. Dao, and I am calling from Canarsie, Lenape land, also known as Brooklyn. Hi, everyone.
Thanks, Dao. And Dao is going to be in conversation with Rae Garringer. Rae is the founder and director of Country Queers. They are a writer, oral historian, and audio producer based in southeastern West Virginia. Rae, we're so happy that you're joining us today. I'll pass it to you to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ella. I'm Rae. I use they, them pronouns, and I am on Satsuyaha and Shawanaki lands here in West Virginia, where I grew up.
Thank you both so much. Well, I think we're going to kick things off, actually, and I think I'm going to pass it over to you, Rae, to give a bit of an introduction to Country Queers, the project that you lead and that is really so incredible. And then Rae and Dao are going to have a conversation to talk a bit more about the project and about oral history and a lot of other things. So I'll pass it over to you, Rae.
And thank you, Val and Dao, for having me, and all of you for joining us. I am a shy hermit introvert who lives alone, and I'm realizing I don't think I've actually talked to other humans today now that I'm on Zoom. So here we go. Country Queers is an ongoing multimedia oral history project that I started in 2013. It has taken a lot of forms and had many lives over the past decade. But at this point, it includes a collection of over 90 oral histories. There's a podcast by the same name. There is a gallery exhibit that's only made it to a few places. And there is going to be a book, thanks to support from Voice of Witness and specifically Dao, who I like to call the fairy godmother of the Country Queers book, which is going to come out in October from Haymarket Books. So I started the project in 2013 out of a personal need to meet and connect with and learn from other rural and small town queer and trans people. I'd spent about a decade away from home, first at college in Western Massachusetts and then in Austin, Texas for several years. And I really bought into this kind of longstanding narrative that I couldn't go home once I had come out as a queer person to rural West Virginia. And then I did move home and was both really overjoyed to be back in the mountains, but also quickly started to feel pretty isolated from queer and political community. And so when I started the project, I didn't have any formal training or really informal training either in oral history or interviewing or audio recording or audio production or any of the things I have learned over the past decade through this project. But in writing the book, it was really helpful to think back through how the sort of political organizing spaces that I was a part of and connected to in Central Appalachia and the South, I think really did provide some kinds of training that were really useful for this kind of an oral history project. And so most notably, the STAY project, which is a Central Appalachian Youth Network I was a part of for many years before aging out 9 years ago, and Southerners on New Ground, SONG, which is a Southern LGBTQ organization. And you can go to the next slide if you want to. So I'm gonna just read a really short excerpt, which is from the introduction to a section of the book that's called The First Year, because this is the first kind of articulation of the project that happened. And for better or worse, I'm someone who doesn't delete emails, which is kind of a nightmare, but it means that I have the first time that I wrote down this idea way back in an email. So I had just gone to a STAY Fabulation Queer Youth Gathering in Knoxville, Tennessee in May of 2013, and then to a SONG Gaycation also in East Tennessee in early June of 2013. So I came home all fired up and emailed one of my best friends, Ada Smith. Hey, Ada, I've wanted to start this project interviewing country queers for a long time. Put them on a blog and maybe a book later, who knows? But I tend to drag my feet because I get scared to ask people if I can interview them. I feel like I just need to start because I'm my own worst enemy sometimes and in terms of lacking the confidence to do shit. I have 2 questions for you. 1, I wonder what you would want to know about other country queers' lives, processes, passions, etc. 2, I've been wanting to buy a voice recorder for years. Finally gonna do it. What was that recorder you suggested? She wrote back, "Hey Ray, this sounds so huge and great and fun, and Song has talked about this, and just go, go, go." And she then went on to tell me some of the things she would want to know from other country queers. I also ended up asking a lot of different friends that same question: what would you want to know from other rural queer people? Which is sort of how the initial question list developed. But that was kind of the first articulation of the idea for the project back in probably July 2013, when I recorded the first interview. So that's just a little bit about the project. Before we shift into conversation between me and Dao, I'm going to play just or have Anaik play just a short clip of audio. This is Courtney. I selected this clip for kind of random reasons. 1, it was already edited down, so I didn't have to go back through to a 2-hour interview and pull a short clip. 2, I don't play this one that often, and I sort of forgot that I had it. And in looking around today, I just remembered how much I enjoyed. I'm a little obsessed with goats. I also have 4 goats outside, soon to be 7 or 10 when they kidnap. Courtney on a road trip in 2014 to gather stories. And this is a little bit of her interview.
We had trepidations when we moved out here. Again, baggage. And we thought we would come home and there would be like a cross burning out in the pasture or something. When we first moved here, we've been here 13 years. So we were very quiet people. We know some really great people, and there are some people that you're just not sure about. And the guy that owns the property next to us is old school farmer from way back. And he's always been really great, and will take care of his horses, and he throws hay over for our goats, and he loves the goats and everything. And the most that I've ever really heard from him is he's like, yeah, you know, people, they talk, but I tell them those girls, there's nothing wrong with them. I don't know what you're talking about, you know, they're great people. So I had an in there, you know, and so I think that we've overcome a lot of prejudices just being good people. So, you know, but we've been told by Merrick's God family that we're just changing Kansas one family at a time.
So that's just a short little glimpse into my conversation with Courtney back in 2014 before we milked her goats. And yeah, that's my intro to country queers before we dive into the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ray. I always get a little teary-eyed whenever I hear you talk about the project and how it started, and I'm trying not to get teary-eyed. Anyway, just to start things off, at Val, we think, you know, a lot about what it means to be the antithesis of that corporate saying that will remain unnamed, about moving fast and breaking things, and why move slow and heal things is much more our vibe. And this is something that I think was so clear and I found so resonant and moving when I happened to find out about country queers. And to me, I would love, you know, let's talk a little bit more about that as an ethos, as a motto. And hopefully we can get specifically to the question of wholeness. I think this project, in terms of like working with you on the book, that became such a strong thread running throughout. So maybe we could start there.
Yeah. Well, Dao, I feel like I remember the first call we had, and I was like, you know, I'll talk to people about oral history over the years, and with you, I was immediately like, yes, like on the same sort of like wavelength. So I just think that also speaks to you, and also Voice of Witness having a really, I think, just a really like beautiful approach to oral history as something that is inherently tied to social justice work, and I think that's what made me interested in working with you. So, yeah, I mean, I think oral history is so slow. How's my internet? Am I freezing? It's
Little
pretty
bit.
bad. Yeah. Having a bad internet day. I am on my hotspot, which is usually better, but I can try switching back if it's not better.
Let's keep going for now, and we'll flag you if it's really bad.
Okay. Okay. So I mean, first of all, I think oral history just is really slow work. I think it moves slow. I think the conversations and the pace is really slow. And it's something that I really love about the form, is that it's not sort of a rushing, like when I do interviews, when I worked at a radio station and was doing more journalistic interviews, you know, I came in with a more narrow focus of what we were looking for, because I knew what the story was about and I knew how much time I had to edit. And I like that in oral history, especially the more comfortable I got with it, at this point, I just want to hear whatever people want to talk about. Like, I really like listening to people talk about their lives and their animals and their, you know, stories of heartbreak, their stories of joy, their stories of coming out, their stories of, I don't know, walking around their land, their favorite little spot in the woods. So I think oral history just like lends itself to slow and to healing. And then I also think that, like, we've talked about this, Dao, you know, I didn't have formal training in oral history, but I think that like slow conversations are sort of culturally a part of the place that I grew up. And I think that's culturally true for many people, and maybe probably at some point all of us, that sitting and just talking to each other, and in the context of West Virginia, like there's a lot of sitting on the porch and just having conversations, that I think is really part of what, like, the feeling of oral history when I'm in an interview with someone, it really draws me to it. Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the sheep? The sheep episodes. I think it was very illuminating. You can explain what I am talking about, for folks who don't know. And I thought that was one of the things that sort of was upended for me in terms of expectations, what I expected to hear in queer country stories. So yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about how we got there.
Oh, I'm so curious how it upended what you expected to hear. But yeah, so I mean, I think like in the beginning of the project, because I had no real idea what I was doing and hadn't really studied oral history, I don't really know why this is the format that I chose. I used to have this sense of like needing to ask everyone the same question. Like I felt like that was, I don't know where I picked up on that, but I thought that's what I was supposed to do. And so I would ask people these like really long questions, and inevitably, like, some people really wanted to talk about identity, and some people had like negative interest in talking about identity and really wanted to talk about, who knows, like food or like the rodeo or like whatever, their church, you know? And so I think as I got more comfortable, I got more interested in just following it in that way. And then so for the sheep episodes that Dao's talking about, for the podcast, for the first season, each episode draws from an oral history interview that I had recorded. And then during the pandemic, during the lockdown part of the pandemic, I was living alone in Eastern Kentucky in a very dark little house at the head of a holler. And, you know, it was winter and I needed a distraction. I needed some joy, and had heard some radio from the UK about sheep and was like, why is there not more sheep radio? So I put a call out on social media to do, to try to like have conversations with other queer and trans people who love sheep. Oh, it's probably important to say I grew up on a sheep farm, so there's like a reason why I chose this animal. I love them a lot. And I thought like maybe a couple people would reach out, and instead there were like 12 or 15 people who were like, yes, please. And so we had these phone and sometimes video calls with bad internet and cell service on both sides. And like we talked about gender and queerness, like that was part of the conversation, but I was more interested and they were more interested in really talking about sheep and in some cases other animals, including alpaca and goats. And it was a really fun process for me to get to like go deep into just like a very particular like niche area of some country queers' lives. But also, I think because of maybe what the project is and who I am and who I was talking to, I think people's reflections on sheep and what they learned from sheep is very much shaped by like queerness and by identity. So those were really fun conversations. Yeah. And I guess to your question about wholeness, I mean, I think that's like something that I hope I've gotten sort of better at as an interviewer over the years of, I think originally I really wanted to ask about like what's challenging, what changes would we need to make rural queer experiences easier? And I think both with like guidance and lessons from narrators and friends of like, ask about joy, ask about humor, ask about celebration, but also my sort of like getting more comfortable and just relaxing and only talking about horses if that's what people wanted to talk about. I do think that as the project evolved, the interviews reflected more of that wholeness, I hope. Yeah.
For sure, for sure. I mean, that's something that I found very poignant is that, you know, as somebody, and maybe this is a benefit of not having been formally trained, is, you know, that you are much more open to having your narrators lead and going where those conversation pathways were going. I'm mindful of time, so let's move on to the next thing. So you were, as Ella mentioned, a storyteller initiative pilot, and a central concern with that program that we're starting at VOW is really about who gets to tell these stories, who gets to have a platform. And we've had, you know, a lot of conversations about visibility and how that visibility is positive, but it also can lead to backlash. So one of the things, you know, about country queers is that I feel in the past, I don't know, 10 years or so, there definitely has been, there's much more material out there. You know, queer and trans people are in the popular media in a way that they haven't been before. So, you know, take that and walk us through some of what that looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that when I started the project in 2013 and had been sort of thinking about it, I think for at least 2 years since moving home in 2011, but I was a regular at this gay country bar in Austin for many years where my whole community there were country queers who had sort of fled to the city, but I'd go out to like a lot of gay rodeos and events with queer people there. So, but when I moved home and when I sort of started thinking about the project, there really was no representation that was easily accessible of rural queer and trans people other than stories of like violence and death, right? So Matthew Shepard, Brandon Tina and Boys Don't Cry, Brokeback Mountain, which I love, but why does he have to die in the end? So I think like that was really the landscape of rural queer representation when I started the project. And then I think at the same time that I was kind of on this journey, this was happening in a lot of other places. There was a new organization in Vermont that I still work with called Out in the Open that was starting. Song had been doing some small town listening sessions across the South. I think it was like happening in a lot of spaces. But yeah, I'd say in the past like 5 years, I feel like there's TV shows with like rural queer characters. There's like Schitt's Creek, right? Which again, I'm like, okay, this is a story about city people going to the country, and like that's what's interesting about it. But there's there's a lot of different sort of like Instagram accounts in particular, I think has been a place where a lot of like rural queer and trans people have found each other, which is amazing. And then I think we're starting to have like more mainstream, like Schitt's Creek, like Somebody Somewhere, is that what it's called? Like, and more, I think, rural queer novels. Like there has been quite a shift, but I do think also, working on this project, but then also at Apple Shop, making radio in the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky for several years. I still think at a national level, the rural stories that get well funded are told by people coming from cities to the country for a minute for a story. And I think it's incredibly hard for rural community-based projects, for rural queer projects to get funding for this kind of work. I also think it's like logistically a lot harder and slower to do this kind of project in a rural space. I mean, if I were just gonna talk about West Virginia queer stories, that would be hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of driving, you know what I mean? And so I think that the landscape still of who's telling rural stories leaves a lot to be desired. And I think that this might be something we were going to talk about at a later point, but like as we approach this national election cycle, it's like I dread, I mean, I know probably everyone is dreading this for many reasons, but there is no other time that I dread the national media representations of my home as much as in a national election year, because we immediately get flattened into Trump country, into this monolith, which I think I wasn't originally aware of, trying to counter that with country queers, but it has very much become part of the goal of the project. But it's like many communities, I think, have experienced this when someone from the outside comes in with an idea already of what the story about your place or your community is, and they tell that story because that's the story they plan to tell, right? And it doesn't represent a wholeness or a fullness or the complexity and the nuance of a place. And so yeah, I'm really grateful to Val and the Storyteller Initiative for the support, and I'm excited about the program that you all are going to continue. It's like supporting oral historians and editors from marginalized communities in telling stories about like our own communities, which I think is still really needed for country queers, for all sorts of groups of people.
For sure. It's making me think a lot about that Silas House quote, who is also a narrator in Country Queers. I don't know if you want to read that.
Sure. Yeah. I was like, do I have it? I do have it right here. Yeah. So Silas House, if people aren't familiar, is he's from East Kentucky. He's a writer. He's currently the poet laureate for the state of Kentucky. He's the first openly gay poet laureate. And he is also a narrator in the project. You can find part of our interview in the podcast, and he'll be in the book. And I forget the name of this piece that he wrote, but this is this quote. He says, "You cannot know a place without loving it and hating it and feeling everything in between. You cannot understand a complex people by only looking at data. Something inside you has to crack to let in the light so your eyes and brain and heart can adjust properly." That would sound much better in Silas's voice, PS. So
Yes, and that actually brings me to a question about, different formats. And Country Queers, I think, is the perfect illuminator of this issue, because it was once just an idea, and then it became a blog, then a photo exhibit, and then a podcast, and soon to be a book. So I think it would be extremely interesting to hear what you think about what is lost and what is gained with these different formats. One of the things you alluded to was not being able to hear someone like Silas in his interview, but go for it.
Yeah.
How do you think these mediums complement each other? How do we still honor narrators, regardless of what format?
Yeah, and I apologize if I'm looking distracted. There's a wasp that's sort of like buzzing around nearby and on my desk, so I'm just keeping an eye on my coworker over here. But yeah, I mean, I think there's like benefits to all of those different formats. I think in the begin, I would say the least beneficial or accessible or engaging, maybe it's not the least accessible, but in the beginning it was just these long transcripts on a blog, and that was a lot of scrolling. And I know like two people who are oral history nerds and like rural queer organizers who read them, but like I wouldn't read those, you know. And I do think it's like it's good to have them, the full interviews, available somewhere. I mean, I think that's one thing in the editing for a podcast. Okay, buddy, can you not do this? That you lose sort of like, ideally to get an oral history down into a podcast episode, you're going to cut, depending on how long that interview is, like at least half of it, right? And so that can be really excruciating, but also ideally people listen to the podcast. And many people do not want to listen to a 2.5 hour unedited oral history in that format. So yeah, I think that, the original dream was always a book, and it was a book that would have photos, full color photos, and also written transcripts. And then the podcast emerged honestly because it felt the most possible to pull off in a short amount of time with a small amount of money after working at Apple Shop, pumping out 8 hours of audio a week for several years. So I wasn't convinced that I did not have any interest or plan to start a podcast. If I had now, knowing what I know, I would have done the whole thing differently and probably might not have done oral histories, right? Because I think that like some of the engaging like richness of like audio production, sound design that I wished I could have done in retrospect, working with interviews I'd recorded maybe 7 years before, like that I wasn't an audio producer. I was just sitting down with the recorder on a table with no microphone and no headphones, thinking I was making a book. And so, I mean, I think that things I love about the podcast form and think are really valuable are that getting to hear people's voices and dialects and the ways that they speak and the pauses, and you can hear the emotion in people's voice, you can hear the laughter. I think, try as we might to put like laughs in brackets and text, it's like it's clunky, and like people's laughs are so particular. So yeah, there are so many narrators that like when I read their transcript, I hear their voice, and I wish that's what everyone was hearing. And Silas is one of them. He just has such a beautiful way of speaking and really, really thick, wonderful East Kentucky dialect. So, and then the gallery exhibit, and what I'm excited about, one of the things I'm excited about for the book is that in the podcast form, people don't get to see people and their places and their animals and their homes, and I think especially in a project dealing with sort of rural spaces, when so many representations of rural places in national mainstream media at least are either of like, poverty, environmental crisis, disaster, or like racist Trump voters. I feel like that's what you see on mainstream media in a rural place for the most part. Being able to like visually see someone like in their home with their dog, or like, outside in their garden, again getting into some of that like that wholeness of people's lives. I think there's something in the photos, some of the photos that really adds a lot of depth to like where the landscapes that people are in, and I think I didn't ask people to describe the landscapes because I wasn't thinking this was going to be an audio project. So yeah, that's a bit of a wander, but I'm glad that it lives in so many different spaces. I don't know that I would recommend doing all of the things to someone starting out, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, you said exactly what I was thinking, which is Maybe we're in some ways really lucky that it went through all these different permutations and that you had the time. I know sometimes it seems a little overwhelming, but the fact that this was cooking for so long, you know, and now it's gonna be a book. Let's talk a little bit about, you know, I think we're getting close to the time for the conversation because we want to be able to have questions and comments from other folks. But what are your dreams about for the future of the overall project? Talk as little or as much as you want to about that. And then specifically, one of the permutations for the book is that we landed on a very different subtitle than the one that we started with, which I won't get into for everyone. But the subtitle that we landed on is A Love Letter, which I remember texting it to you like, oh, I don't know if Rae's gonna like this. And your response was, and why?
No, it made me cry. It made me tear up. No, we're just gonna make each other cry. But yeah, I totally. And just for maybe people to have, the wasp is now on my computer screen now. It's like currently sitting on your shoulder. So just if I am like looking crazy at you all, this is what's happening here. And I'm gonna wait till the end of this webinar to put it outside. But yeah, I mean, so the previous possibilities for the subtitle were like 11,000 miles of back roads, porch sitting, and a quest to find our stories. Like it was long, and we were trying to play around with all these things and like how do we, you know, and then Dao texted me that the other folks at Haymarket thought about just a love letter, and I did. I like started crying. Because it feels like I don't know, somehow I think to me the book, I don't know that it's a completion of the project, but it is some kind of a completion of like the original dream in 2013 was a book because I don't know, because I love books, because I grew up in the country without TV or internet, because I was living without TV or internet or a cell phone at the time the project started. And I think that there is something about this book that feels like really amazing after, you know, it'll be about 11 years, I guess, when it comes out. And I do think the original hope was really that the project could, you know, felt extremely isolated from queer people when I started this project. I still do at times. I will be totally honest. Like that has not gone away from me. It's not like I now 10 years in, I'm like, now I figured out how to like do country queerness and not have it be incredibly fucking stressful and like isolating and also wonderful and joyful. And also there are days where I'm like, this is totally nuts, Rae, what are you doing? So I think like the idea of being able to like, oh my gosh, buddy, this is the most interactive wasp I've had in here in a long time. I'm sorry. But yeah, being able to like think of this book as almost like a gift to other rural queer and trans people who are isolated or who have felt that isolation of like like a love letter to us that and an affirmation that like we have always been here, even if we know that there are days where, and I think especially these days with all of this legislation and escalation of physical violence, I think just like that, I hope that like being able to hold a physical thing that's like a little bit of our collective history. Yeah, it does. It feels like it's like we're just gonna cry together now. But like, yeah, I that feels really good to me. I think after, especially a lot of like highs and lows and overwhelm and burnout and all sorts of things along the way of this project. So I love that it's called a love letter. This Country Queer's a love letter. And in terms of the future of the rest of the project, like, I don't know, who knows? All of my advisors were like, take a break from thinking about it. Let yourself rest for a minute. You're really burnt out. The book is coming out. That'll be exciting. So that's where we're at.
Yeah. I also just want to remind you that that subtitle love letter didn't come from nowhere. It was, I remember something that you said to me in describing the book, you know, when we talked about it way back when.
I don't remember that.
Well, so that's why you have an editor. So let's bring Ella back in to help us go through some comments and questions.
Yeah, I just have a big smile on my face because I love listening to the two of you talk together, and I was also tearing up at times as well. Yeah, I think the love that's in this project as well as in this conversation and just in the art of storytelling and the craft of storytelling is so evident. So thank you both so much for sharing in this conversation. Thank you so much, Rae, for being here. We do have a few questions in the chat, so we'll start there, and other people can also drop some questions in, but I'll start with a more straightforward one. Fanny Garcia, hi Fanny, is asking, when will the book be out, and are you planning to do a book tour?
Yeah. Hi, Fanny. The book is coming out October 8th. It has an official birthday. And yes, I'm planning a book tour. It is very vague at the moment. But yeah. Yeah.
If you all have connections in your place and want to bring Rae, let us know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I do know. Well, speaking of out in the open up in Vermont, I'm gonna go do an audio workshop with them in Maine in November. So we'll try to do some Northeast things in November for sure. And definitely some Appalachian Southern stops. But details aren't set yet. Yeah.
And we'll have a slide at the end of the webinar where you can, with all kinds of places to follow country queers, so you can keep up to date on Rae's movements when the book comes out. Thank you, Rae. Stevie asks, are there any oral history courses or trainings that people can recommend, especially in multilingual environments, especially for someone who comes from a longer background of political asylum intakes, e.g. having to be very chronologically and detail oriented? So yeah, any oral history courses or trainings that you, maybe both of you, might recommend as resources? I know that, okay, go ahead, Dad. I don't know if you were going to share about some of Voice of Witness's resources.
Go for it.
Well, just to say that, VOW, we are an oral history organization, so we do have a number of resources that you can find to talk about doing oral history. The main one I would recommend is our book, Say It Forward, which is basically a DIY guide to doing social justice driven storytelling. So that's a really great, just primer and introduction to doing oral history, especially from our very ethics focused methodology. And it includes some different field case studies and field notes from some different community oral history projects. So that would be a great, I think that's a great place to start, and you can find that on our website. But yeah, there's a number of other resources that I'll see if Dao and Rae, if you all have any ideas as well.
For sure. If I understand the question correctly, you have Fanny on the call who has a lot to say about doing both kinds of interviews. And I would say Oral History Summer School is a great resource to check out. VOW also has webinars. We're doing a series, I think, in May and June. Check the website for the schedule, and those are coming up, soon. I would not say, I don't think you have to go to like OMA, Oral History Master's Program at Columbia. It's great and has turned out a lot of excellent oral historians, but I think there are a lot of different resources and, things worth checking out as well. Any other part of that question that I missed? And then Rae, you are doing a training, you said in November. So there are particular groups that,
Yeah. No, I don't have anything to add really. That's a specific organization, rural queer Maine audio training. But Voice of Witness and Fanny, I fully underline both of those suggestions for
Yeah, thanks, Rae. And to shout out Fanny's work, especially if you might be interested in like a political, more like immigrant rights setting Fanny did our first oral history in practice conversation. So if the person who asked that question, if you want to email us at the end, we can share the webinar recording from Fanny's conversation, which might provide some specific insights to that. All right, so our next question is from Savannah, who said, I would be curious to hear your reflections on queer rural well-being, dreams, and more in the face of climate impacts. What stories have you heard, or do you want to hear? And they say that this question is coming from two places. I do climate work, and I'm curious how we can embrace stories to support queer rural lifestyles as climate affects the land we call home. And two, I grew up rurally and farmed for quite some time and dream of returning soon to rural farm life. Any thoughts on what it means to capture queer oral futures through this type of storytelling? And again, that was Savannah. Thank you, Savannah.
That's a great question. I'm gonna try not to ramble all over the place. I mean, I think that, yes, climate impacts are so real and they're so present. I think that, I mean, I think this project alone, if we just want to think about that, has been directly affected by multiple climate sort of disasters in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky that, again, speaking of sort of like rural stories and where and who tells what, like many of these have never made it to a national audience. I think this is something I see happen a lot in these times of climate crisis, is the ways that these disasters in rural spaces often don't capture the national attention in the same way that something affecting major coastal cities does. And some of that you could say is because like the numbers aren't sensational enough, but I also think it's about a lack of sort of very like mainstream city-based understandings of rural life and rural spaces. And so personally, I think a lot about climate impacts and futures and realities, and have a lot of grief and a lot of anger and like so many of us, right? But yeah, I mean, I think one thing I've been thinking about some just in an Appalachian context, but also through some work I do with the National Council of Elders on an oral history project and podcast, which is called The Nerve: Conversations from Movement Elders, is how again and again and again in interviews with queer and trans organizers, they will call out the fact that across issues, there are so many queer and trans people leading our movements right now. And I think that's really true in climate sort of resiliency work. There's a lot of queer and trans organizers, and that isn't necessarily the story of those movements, but that's something I'm interested in, a story I would want to hear. I think in terms of stories that I have heard from narrators, a couple people I've interviewed in Texas talked a lot about climate and industry impacts and how it affected their rural lives. That's definitely something that comes up a lot in Appalachian country queer interviews. And then, yeah, queer oral futures. I don't even know. That sounds so cool.
I made it up when I dropped it in the chat. I was like,
I like it. I'm like, yeah, I'd love to hear more about it. It sounds great. Let's go that way in a more positive dreaming lens. Yeah.
Isn't there that series from University of...
Oh, yeah. Good point, Dao. There's a book series out of the University Press of Kentucky that's a new series called Appalachian Futures, that's focused on publishing work from Black and Indigenous and queer and trans writers. And so, yeah, I don't know everything that has come out and is going to come out from that series, but that's a good one. And I've edited a collection of essays and poems by queer and trans and two-spirit Appalachian writers that'll be coming out from them in the spring of 2025 that does have there's some climate stuff in there, and definitely some future dreaming and some time travel, some queer and trans and two-spirit time travel. Yeah.
I think it speaks to the deeply intersectional, complexity when you look at people's lives in fullness and in wholeness. That's, you can't avoid things like that.
Yeah.
I think we have time for at least one or two more questions. This is from Chelsea. They share that in my experience, rural working class people are more fundamentally accepting of my genderqueer identity than liberal middle class folks. They may not be familiar with the concepts, with the theory, with pronoun politics, but they're more readily accepting of who I am. Whereas politically correct people familiar with the buzzwords of gender theory may talk the talk, but ultimately have more rigid expectations of people based on their assigned at birth gender. I attribute this to class-based socialization, with middle-class gender roles being more rigid and working-class culture having more naturally blended gender roles out of both necessity and the pace of life aspect Rae mentioned of taking time to sit on the porch, sit at the kitchen counter, and actually talk to people and get to know them, basing their assessment on whether or not they're good people. Is this an experience that's been mentioned by anyone you've interviewed, Rae? And I know it kind of seemed to come up in, I believe their name was Courtney, who we heard an excerpt from, but has that come up in other interviews that people could listen to on the podcast potentially?
I'd have to think about through the podcast who's in it and what's in it. So let me put that over here for a minute. But yes, not specifically around gender exactly, but I think that again and again and again, especially people I've interviewed who are in the place where they grew up, not who like have moved from a city or moved to a totally different kind of rural community. I think there's a lot of that comes forward, that like if people get to know you before they know you're queer, and they, you have a relationship and you have some kind of connection about other things, they're much less likely to have a problem with it. And I think that also people have told me that sort of, it's interesting because I think things are kind of different now than they were when I started interviewing people because of this visibility and because of this national political kind of like attack on trans people in particular. I think it's actually a little different than it was in the early years. But yeah, people would say, I remember a friend from East Kentucky saying like people might be scared of like the gays in like a national sense, like the scary city political gays or something. But then there'd be like, but that's like, they know your mom and your brother and your cousin and your family if you're in the place you grew up in. And so there has been, I think, some like acceptance of like, that's our gay, that has been a part of some people's rural queer experience. But I also think, I joke all the time with friends about like all the like apparently straight butch women that I grew up knowing in West Virginia. I guess they're straight, but I don't know, man. They're like butcher than me. That's for sure. Who like cut all their own firewood and drive the biggest truck and have this huge chainsaw. So I do think I will say, I think that there's probably clearly there's no like overarching generalizations I would feel comfortable making, but I do think particularly for like white, more masculine presenting women or more like butch or trans mask people, that at least in the place that I live, there's a bit more of like a cultural acceptance of that, where I think for queer and trans people of color in lots of rural spaces, depending on where and what that community makeup is, but also for more like, effeminate gay men or like people whose gender identities bend in a direction that tends to, I think, get a lot more pushback at minimum, but potentially even violence, right? So there's some really, I think, all sorts of complicated pieces of this, but those are some thoughts from that question.
Thanks, Rae. Really appreciate that response. We're almost out of time, but I just want to touch on a question that Linda has asked. Hey, Linda, maybe this is more for Dao to talk about the Storyteller Initiative, but at what point in your long, multifaceted oral history journey did you connect up with Val? How did that relationship work in practical terms?
Oh, I think that's more for Rae.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, it was 2022 in June, and it is now 2024 in April. So it was 2 years ago, and the project turned 10 last year. So 9 years in. And to be totally honest, I was really burnout and was like, it's over. We're done. We're not doing this anymore. I emailed the editorial team of the podcast and was like, I'm burnout. I'm sick. I have a chronic illness. I like didn't have water. My spring was dried up. My internet is bad. I was broke. And I'd applied to a fellowship that I did not get. I was just kind of juggling a bunch of part-time jobs and tired, really tired. I do think sometimes I feel like I shouldn't talk about that, but I actually think it's like important to talk about how these kinds of projects without funding for a long time are actually like it'll take a toll, you know? And so I just got an email from Dao that was, she had found out about the project. She'd been thinking about the project and wanted to know if I was interested in talking about publishing possibilities. And so I really like, I'm not joking when I call her the fairy godmother of the Country Queers book, because I was like, I don't know, I'm over it right now. And then Dao showed up, and then we kind of immediately, like I was saying earlier, I felt just like pretty immediately like clicked with Dao, but also like her approach to oral history and her description of the work that Voice of Witness did. And so then, yeah, through this Storyteller Initiative pilot program, Dao and Val supported me in writing a book proposal, which I wouldn't have done it. I was too tired, and I was kind of like, the podcast is the thing. So it really wouldn't have happened without Dao and without Voice of Witness. And so I got support from Dao to write that proposal, submitted it to Haymarket, it got accepted, and then Dao has helped me really every step of the way since, but including during that pilot initiative program with like developing a work plan and a timeline, and organization is not something I also had training in and is a huge part of this work. So yes.
And I came to know about the project kind of two ways. One was just being on Instagram and, you know, being exposed to some of the projects that you were talking about earlier. And I remember seeing the two pink boots and like listening to a couple of the interviews that you had posted up there. And I went to listen to the podcast, and I also dove deeper because I was on the selection committee for that NEH Oral History Association Fellowship, which is what you applied to. And your project was so close to being one of the fellows that got selected, but didn't make it in. And I felt like I had to make it my mission in life to make sure that it didn't end there. And I saw what you were trying to do. Your proposal spoke to me. And like I said, it was so resonant in terms of, I thought the urgency, the importance, the necessity of it, you know, continuing and existing as more than just a podcast, even though I love the podcast. I think that it can do more, and it will do more. And that's, you know.
Perfect.
I'm so glad you read.
Well, thank you so much to Rae and to Dao for this really beautiful conversation. And thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate being in this space with you and getting to share with you. Definitely please support Country Queers. You can follow from the different handles on the screen. You can follow the project on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. There's also Patreon to follow and support the project. And to subscribe to the podcast, and of course the book, which is coming out October 8th, right? That's the book's birthday. So please support the project, and please stay in touch with Val. You know, doing events like webinars like this where we can talk about oral history in different ways is what we're all about. So we have another webinar called Storytelling for Social Change, which is just more generally talking about some of the mechanics of our methodology. That's going to be in May. You can also download some of our free oral history resources and lesson plans on our website. website. If you want support on a specific project, or you just want to reach out about different questions about how to work together, you can visit our website, visit our services section, or just email me, ella@voiceofwitness.org, and we can chat. Love chatting with folks, and follow us on social media to stay up to date on different projects that we're doing, different events we're having. Yeah, if you're interested in storytelling and how it can be used as a tool for social justice, please connect with us at Dao. That's what we love doing, and we love to get to connect with you. So thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.